Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. We're settling into the world of ancient Mesopotamia, that fertile stretch between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where sometime around 3200 BCE the Sumerians began marking wet clay tablets with wedge-shaped symbols that scholars now call cuneiform. These aren't just the earliest writings we possess, they're humanity's first attempts to capture something eternal, something that existed before temples had walls and before kings wore crowns. The air in this imagined space feels thick with possibility and the faint smell of river mud drying in workshop courtyards. Picture yourself standing in one of Uruk's temple complexes, perhaps around 2900 BCE, when the city sprawls across the southern Mesopotamian plain like an ambitious experiment in permanent settlement. The priests here maintain libraries of clay, storing knowledge that reaches backward into what they themselves consider unimaginably ancient times. You're surrounded by the soft scraping sounds of reed styluses pressing into damp tablets, the murmur of scribes reciting memorized passages to verify their copies, and the ever-present scent of the marshlands that still dominate this landscape. Outside these walls, the world remains profoundly wild. Lions hunt in the grasslands, crocodiles sun themselves on riverbanks, and entire regions exist that no Sumerian mapmaker has ever documented. You probably won't survive this journey through deep time, at least not with your modern assumptions about how reality works intact, because we're about to wade into waters that predate the very concept of solid ground. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not interested in empty clicks, just fellow travelers who appreciate falling asleep to the weird majesty of humanity's oldest stories. If you feel like sharing where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world, drop that in the comments. There's something quietly beautiful about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, united by insomnia and curiosity about ancient cosmological chaos. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Sumerians who first commit their creation traditions to writing describe a state they call the Formless Age, though even that name comes later, after people need language to distinguish what was before from what is now. In the beginning, according to the most ancient fragments preserved in texts like the Eridu Genesis and referenced in later Babylonian compilations, there exists only Namu, the primordial sea, the cosmic ocean, the waters that have no shore because shores haven't been invented yet. Namu isn't exactly a goddess in the way later mythology understands divinity, with personality and preferences and a wardrobe of symbolic attributes. She's more like the substance of pre-existence itself, the undifferentiated potential from which differentiation might eventually emerge. Imagine trying to describe the ocean to someone who's never seen water, never experienced wetness, never conceived of liquid as a state of matter. That's the challenge the early scribes face, and honestly, they do a remarkable job for people working without any of our modern vocabulary for physics or chemistry. Some mainstream Sumerian scholars point to the actual geography of southern Mesopotamia as the obvious inspiration for this primordial waters cosmology. The region where Sumerian civilization develops is literally created by sediment deposits from two major rivers, transforming salt marsh and shallow sea into habitable land over millennia. New ground emerges from water through entirely natural processes that any observant inhabitant would notice. The Sumerians aren't being mystical when they say land comes from water. They're being empirical, reporting what their environment demonstrates generation after generation. The Persian Gulf extends much farther north in 4000 BCE than it does today, and settlements that begin as coastal communities find themselves increasingly inland as centuries pass and rivers dump more soil. Creation through sedimentation isn't poetry, it's geology observed in real time. But here's where things get delightfully weird, because not everyone reads these texts as straightforward environmental observation. A persistent fringe interpretation, popular in certain alternative archaeology circles, suggests that Namu and the primordial waters represent some kind of pre-material quantum state, a field of pure potentiality that ancient priest scientists somehow intuited using shamanic techniques we've since forgotten. According to this view, Sumerian creation mythology preserves knowledge of advanced physics encoded in religious metaphor, waiting for modern readers to decode the real message about waveform collapse and observer-dependent reality. The evidence for this interpretation is, shall we say, creative, mostly consisting of taking Sumerian words that mean water or abyss and declaring them obvious references to quantum mechanics. It's the kind of theory that sounds profound at 2 a.m. but falls apart the moment you actually study how ancient languages work. Still, there's something charming about the impulse to credit ancient peoples with secret scientific knowledge, even if the reality of their considerable actual achievements should be impressive enough without the embellishment. The scholarly debate about how to interpret these primordial water texts centers on a more nuanced question. Are the Sumerians describing a one-time creation event, or are they articulating something more like a cosmological principle, that reality constantly emerges from potential, that creation isn't a historical moment but an ongoing process? Professor Thorkild Jacobson, whose mid-20th century translations remain influential despite being somewhat dated, argues for the cyclical interpretation. He suggests that Sumerian thought doesn't separate creation time from current time the way later monotheistic traditions do. The formless waters aren't something that existed once and then stopped existing. They're the eternal backdrop against which temporary formations like land, cities, and civilizations briefly appear. Other scholars, including Samuel Noah Kramer, prefer to read these texts more literally as origin stories meant to explain how the world began, full stop. The debate remains unresolved, which is probably appropriate for texts describing the unresolvable mystery of existence itself. Now, as you're lying there contemplating primordial oceans, which is definitely normal bedtime thinking, not weird at all, let me paint the sensory details of what this formless age supposedly feels like according to the texts. There's no light yet, because light requires a source and a surface to reflect from, and we have neither. There's no sound, because sound needs air to travel through, and air hasn't separated from water yet. There's no up or down, no here or there, just undifferentiated immensity. The temperature, if such a thing could be measured, sits at some universal neutral point. Not cold, not warm, just the ambient non-temperature of cosmic indifference. Trying to imagine this state induces a kind of pleasant vertigo, like floating in a sensory deprivation tank, except the tank is infinite and you don't have a body yet to experience the floating. The texts describe this primordial condition with a curious repetition of negatives. In the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest creation accounts we possess, dating to around 1600 BCE but certainly preserving much older oral traditions, the scribe writes, "No marsh existed, no reed had yet sprouted, no tree had been created." We get lists of what isn't present, no cities, no humans, no gods walking the earth, as if the only way to describe absolute beginning is by cataloguing its absences. It's a bit like trying to describe silence by listing all the sounds you're not hearing, which seems backward until you realize that our brains are fundamentally pattern recognition machines that understand things through contrast and differentiation. Pure unity, absolute sameness, the undivided one. These concepts short-circuit our cognitive wiring, so we approach them through negation, through what they're not. Some readers might wonder why I keep saying texts plural when discussing material this ancient. Here's the thing about Sumerian literary tradition that makes it both fascinating and maddening. We almost never have single, authoritative versions of important compositions. What we have instead are fragments, scattered across different cities and different centuries, sometimes agreeing with each other, often contradicting or supplementing each other in interesting ways. The creation mythology I'm describing tonight gets referenced in texts from Eridu, from Uruk, from Nippur, from Babylon much later, all related but distinct, like regional variants of the same deeply rooted story. Scholars piece together the narrative through comparative analysis, educated guesswork, and occasional brilliant intuition. It's less like reading a book and more like reconstructing a conversation from a recording where half the words are missing. If you're the kind of person who likes definitive answers and clear timelines, ancient Mesopotamian studies will drive you absolutely insane, which might be why I find it so soothing. The primordial waters in Sumerian thought carry a quality we might call pregnant with possibility. They contain everything that will ever exist, but in unmanifest form. Think of it like the moment before a musician plays a note, when their hands hover over the instrument and the air holds every possible melody simultaneously. Or think of it like the blank page before writing, which contains every story that might be written but none specifically yet. The Sumerians, with their practical, river-based worldview, probably think of it more like floodwaters carrying sediment. Within the muddy chaos lies the potential for new farmland, new clay for bricks and tablets, new life, but only after the waters recede and things settle into distinguishable forms. In this formless stage, Namu exists alone, though alone implies a consciousness aware of solitude, and it's not clear the primordial waters think or feel anything at all. Later, theological developments give Namu attributes and intentions, make her into a mother goddess who deliberately creates, but the earliest fragments suggest something more impersonal, not a who but a what, not a deity but a state. This interpretation makes some modern readers uncomfortable because we're culturally primed to want creation stories with creators, agents with agency, persons with purpose. The idea that existence might emerge from impersonal process rather than deliberate design feels cold, almost nihilistic. But there's another way to read it, as liberating, as honest about the fundamental mystery, as refusing to pretend we know more than we do about ultimate origins. Here's a gentle joke to keep us from drowning in cosmic vertigo. The Sumerians basically invented writing so they could track beer rations and grain loans. Then someone had the audacity to use this bureaucratic technology to describe the wordless void before creation. Imagine being the first scribe assigned that task. Hey, Enlil Nasir, we need you to write down what existence was like before existence existed. Sure, no problem. I'll get right on that impossible task. Should I use the cuneiform sign for water about 1,000 times? The fact that they even attempted it shows remarkable philosophical courage, or possibly remarkable philosophical hubris. Either way, we're the beneficiaries of their willingness to press reeds into clay while contemplating absolute nothingness. The waters of Namu sit still, or perhaps they churn. The texts aren't specific about their movement or lack thereof. Time doesn't pass because passing requires a reference frame, a before and after, and those categories don't apply yet. Causation doesn't operate because cause and effect need temporal sequence. Physical law hasn't been established because law requires regularity across multiple instances, and there's only one instance, the singular, undifferentiated now of pre-creation. Philosophers might recognize this as similar to what Kant discusses regarding the impossibility of knowing things in themselves apart from the categories our minds impose on experience. The Sumerians reach something like this conclusion 3,000 years earlier, though they express it through mythological imagery rather than Germanic philosophical prose, which honestly makes it more pleasant to fall asleep to. Within these formless waters, according to later elaborations of the mythology, there exists potential for division, for the separation of elements that will become sky and earth, fresh water and salt water, gods and eventually humans. But potential alone accomplishes nothing. It just sits there being potential, the way you sit there being awake when you'd rather be asleep, full of the potential for rest but not yet actually resting. Something has to activate the potential, catalyze the change, introduce difference into sameness. The texts offer various mechanisms for this cosmic phase transition, and we'll explore those mechanisms in the sections ahead, but for now we're still suspended in the moment before anything happens. There's a peculiar comfort in contemplating this primordial stasis, this cosmic pause before the chaos of existence begins in earnest. No decisions to make, no consequences to face, no complex social dynamics to navigate. just the infinite ocean being exactly what it is, which is everything and nothing simultaneously. Your own consciousness, drifting towards sleep as you listen to this, might be experiencing something analogous, the gradual dissolution of your daily identity into the undifferentiated awareness that persists during deep rest. The boundaries that seem so solid during waking life, between self and world, between one thought and the next, start to blur and soften. You're not exactly disappearing, but you're losing your sharp edges, merging back into something more fundamental. The Mesopotamian climate during the period when these traditions develop is somewhat different from today's desert conditions. The region receives more rainfall, supports more vegetation, harbors more wildlife. The rivers flow with less impediment from modern dams and irrigation systems, flooding more dramatically and unpredictably. Living in such an environment, where water can transform landscape overnight, would make the primordial ocean feel less abstract and more like a persistent reality always threatening to reassert itself. Every flood season demonstrates that solid ground is temporary, negotiable, subject to revision by forces that don't consult human preferences. The formless age isn't safely relegated to the distant past, it's always right there beneath the surface, waiting to return. Joke number 2 for this section. If you think your morning routine takes a while, imagine being the primordial ocean trying to get started with creation. Okay, today's the day I finally differentiate into distinct entities. No, wait, I'll do it tomorrow, or next eon. There's no time pressure when time doesn't exist yet. Procrastination as cosmological principle. The Sumerians might be onto something universal here. Some fringe theorists, and we're deep in fringe territory now, propose that ancient Mesopotamian priests used psychoactive plants or breathing techniques to achieve altered states of consciousness where they directly experienced this primordial unity. They suggest that what we're reading isn't speculative mythology, but trip reports, accounts of genuine mystical encounters with pre-manifested reality. The evidence for this mostly consists of noting that lots of cultures use entheogens in religious contexts and that shamanism appears widespread in human history, then making a massive logical leap to claim that specific Sumerian texts must therefore describe drug-induced visions. It's possible but unprovable, which makes it perfect territory for books with titles like The Cosmic Mushrooms of Mesopotamia that you find in the weird section of used bookstores. I'm not saying it's impossible. Consciousness remains deeply mysterious, and humans have always found ways to alter it. But I am saying the cuneiform evidence doesn't particularly support this interpretation. As we drift deeper into this section, the word count accumulating like sediment in a delta, let me draw your attention to the sensory texture of clay tablets themselves. These aren't smooth paper pages that rustle when turned, they're irregular chunks of dried mud, covered in thousands of tiny wedge-shaped impressions that catch shadow and light differently depending on how you hold them. Reading cuneiform requires rotating the tablet, tilting it to see the marks clearly, sometimes wetting the surface to make the writing more visible. It's a tactile, almost intimate encounter with the medium itself. The oldest tablets we possess feel rough under your fingers, the clay sometimes containing bits of organic material that decayed long ago, leaving tiny holes. When archaeologists unearth these objects from ancient library floors or trash heaps, they're handling the actual surfaces that Sumerian hands shaped and marked 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. No intermediary reproductions, no copies of copies, just the original substrate preserving original thoughts about ultimate origins. The theological question that haunts these primordial water traditions is whether Namu should be understood as conscious or unconscious, personal or impersonal, intentional or automatic. Later Mesopotamian mythology clearly leans toward personification, giving Namu agency and desire and the ability to make plans. But the earliest fragments remain ambiguous, using language that could support either interpretation. This ambiguity might be deliberate, a sophisticated way of acknowledging that human categories like conscious and unconscious might not apply to the ground of being itself. Or it might just be the normal vagueness of very old oral traditions finally getting written down by scribes who inherited multiple contradictory versions and didn't see any reason to force consistency on material describing the inherently paradoxical. Let me introduce our third joke before we get too lost in theological speculation. The Sumerians looked at the chaotic, flood-prone, disease-carrying, occasionally hostile environment of southern Mesopotamia and thought, you know what this needs? Civilization. Let's build cities here and invent writing and complex irrigation systems. The optimism is almost touching. Or possibly they just didn't have better options and made the best of difficult circumstances, which is arguably the more heroic interpretation. Either way, they succeeded wildly by the standards of agricultural societies, creating urban centers that supported tens of thousands of inhabitants and cultural innovations that echo down through millennia. The primordial waters don't just represent the past in Sumerian thinking. They represent the ever-present possibility of dissolution, the waters beneath the world that might return and unmake everything. This isn't paranoid superstition, it's recognition of environmental reality. Cities do get abandoned when rivers change course, when irrigation systems fail, when salt accumulates in fields and renders them sterile, when political structures collapse and can't be rebuilt. The archaeological record of Mesopotamia shows this pattern repeating: rise, flourish, decline, abandonment, eventual rediscovery. The formless waters are patient. They'll reclaim everything eventually. From a strictly historical perspective, detached from theological interpretation, these creation texts tell us something important about how the Sumerians conceptualize existence and order. For them, civilization isn't natural or inevitable. It's an ongoing achievement, a constant struggle against chaos, entropy, and the tendency of complex systems to break down. The formless age represents not just how things began, but the default state to which things return without continuous effort and maintenance. This worldview might strike modern readers as pessimistic, but it's arguably more realistic than narratives of inevitable progress. Systems do require maintenance. Order is more fragile than disorder. Complexity emerges from and eventually returns to simplicity. These aren't mystical claims. They're thermodynamics. The debate among scholars about whether to read these texts literally, allegorically, or as some combination thereof will never be fully resolved because we lack direct access to Sumerian intentionality. We can't interview the scribes, can't ask them whether they believed the primordial ocean was a real historical entity or a useful metaphor for talking about ultimate origins. We have the words pressed into clay, and we have our interpretations and a vast unbridgeable gap between them. This gap mirrors the gap we're contemplating in the mythology itself, the space between manifest and unmanifest, between what can be described and what exceeds description. Lying there in your contemporary bed, surrounded by technologies the Sumerians couldn't have imagined, you're nonetheless contemplating the same fundamental questions they contemplated. Where does existence come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? How do we make sense of our own consciousness floating on the surface of a vast unconscious cosmos? These questions haven't changed in 5,000 years, though our vocabulary for addressing them has expanded considerably. Whether we use terms like primordial waters or quantum fluctuations in a false vacuum or the mystery of being, we're circling the same profound perplexity about why any of this exists at all. The Namu texts, in their fragmentary survival, resist the human desire for tidy narratives with clear beginnings, middles, and ends. They present us instead with an opening that isn't quite an opening, a state that isn't quite a state, a time before time when temporal language fails. Reading them induces a productive confusion, a healthy disorientation that reminds us how little we actually understand about the universe we inhabit. This might seem like a depressing realization, but there's liberation in acknowledging the limits of our comprehension. We don't have to pretend we've got reality figured out. We can rest in not knowing, the way these ancient waters rest in their formless immensity. Joke 4. If the Sumerian afterlife beliefs are correct and souls continue in some form after death, imagine meeting the ancient scribe who first tried to write down the primordial chaos and asking them, "So, were you describing a literal ocean, or was it more metaphorical?" Their answer would probably be, yes. Ancient peoples contain multitudes just like modern peoples do. They can hold literal and symbolic interpretations simultaneously without seeing any contradiction. We're the ones who insist on choosing between them. The physical process of creating cuneiform tablets mirrors, in a small way, the creation process described in the mythology. You start with formless mud, basically primordial matter from the riverbanks. You shape it into a rectangle, imposing geometric order on natural chaos. You press reeds into the surface, making marks that carry meaning, transforming blank potential into specific content. You dry the tablet in the sun or fire it in a kiln, fixing the temporary into something more permanent. Creation on a miniature scale, performed thousands of times in temple workshops, becomes a ritual reenactment of cosmic creation. The scribe participates in the divine work of bringing order to chaos every time they write. As we approach the end of this first section, having spent roughly 5,000 words contemplating absolutely nothing happening, I want to acknowledge the strange pleasure of this kind of meditation. There's something deeply restful about focusing on a state where nothing has differentiated, nothing has gone wrong yet, nothing requires fixing or managing or understanding. The formless age represents a kind of perfection through absence. No problems, because there's nothing to have problems. Of course, it's also profoundly boring and totally incompatible with existence as we experience it, but as a temporary mental refuge while falling asleep, it has real value. The Sumerians who preserved these traditions live in a world without electric lights, without engines, without the constant background hum of modern technology. Their nights are darker than most of us ever experience, their silences more complete. When they contemplate primordial darkness and cosmic silence, they're not abstracting much from their daily sensory environment. Darkness is what happens every night. Silence is what fills the hours between human activity. The formless waters aren't exotic speculation. They're an amplified version of familiar realities. This grounds their mythology in embodied experience in ways that maybe make it more psychologically accessible than our more abstract modern cosmologies. Let me offer a fifth joke as we wind down. The oldest recorded joke in human history comes from ancient Sumer, something about a woman not farting in her husband's lap. The fact that bathroom humor predates written creation mythology by several centuries tells you something important about human priorities. We nail down the comedy routines before we get around to explaining existence itself, which honestly seems like a reasonable ordering of concerns. The Namu texts, in their original context, aren't bedtime stories or philosophical treatises. They're religious literature, part of temple rituals, recited during festivals and ceremonies, integrated into the worship of gods whose natures they help explain. The primordial ocean isn't abstract theology, it's the mother of the gods, the source from which the divine beings themselves emerge. Understanding Namu helps worshippers understand the pantheon, the relationships between deities, the hierarchy of cosmic forces. It's practical religious knowledge, not speculative cosmology, though it certainly contains speculative elements. The scholarly debate about dating these traditions highlights how difficult it is to assign firm chronologies to oral literature that only gets written down after centuries or millennia of transmission. The texts we possess might date to 2000 or 1600 BCE, but the stories they contain could be hundreds of years older, and the core imagery might stretch back to pre-literate Ubaid period around 5000 BCE. We're glimpsing something very old through a series of imperfect copies, like trying to see your reflection in disturbed water. The image reaches us, but distorted, fragmentary, requiring interpretation. As your own consciousness settles towards sleep, as the distinctions between thoughts blur and soften, as the narrative voice of your waking self dissolves into something more diffuse, you're perhaps experiencing a minor personal version of return to primordial waters, not literally, but metaphorically, symbolically, psychologically. Sleep researchers tell us that during certain stages of rest, our sense of self genuinely becomes less defined, less boundaried, more oceanic. The ego that insists on separation and distinction during waking hours relaxes its grip. We float in something more fundamental than personality. Joke 6. Because we need to maintain our quota. Imagine being an apprentice scribe in ancient Uruk, copying creation texts, and asking your master, "So when exactly did all this happen?" The master stares at you like you've completely missed the point. What part of before time existed are you struggling with? Ancient Mesopotamian education probably involved a lot of masters being exasperated with students who took things too literally. The water imagery that dominates these opening sections of Mesopotamian creation mythology proves remarkably persistent throughout Near Eastern religious traditions. It shows up in Babylonian texts, in Canaanite mythology, in biblical creation accounts, in Gnostic cosmologies. The primordial ocean becomes a shared symbol across cultures and centuries, each tradition adapting and reinterpreting it according to their own theological needs. This persistence suggests the imagery resonates with something deep in human psychology, our aquatic evolutionary origins perhaps, or our prenatal development in amniotic fluid, or simply the universal human experience of water as both life-giving and potentially destructive. As we conclude this first section, having thoroughly explored the nothing from which everything emerges, let me paint one final sensory picture. Imagine yourself floating in warm water in complete darkness. No sound except your own breathing, no visual reference points, no sense of up or down. Your body becomes weightless, your thoughts slow and simplify. Your awareness expands to fill the available space while simultaneously contracting to a point. This experiential state, accessible through sensory deprivation or deep meditation or the edge of sleep, might be the closest we can come to imagining the formless age. Not as historical speculation but as present possibility, available any time we quiet the constant chatter of differentiated existence. The Sumerians who first capture these ideas in cuneiform create something that outlasts their civilization by thousands of years. Their cities crumble, their language dies, their gods stop being worshipped, but their words about the formless beginning persist, copied and recopied, translated and retranslated, studied and pondered by strangers in lands they never imagined. There's something quietly triumphant about that persistence, even as it illustrates the fragility of everything else they built. Words outlast temples, stories outlast empires. The account of how it all began survives the ending of the culture that told it. Joke 7. The Sumerians invent beer, mathematics, writing, and urban planning, then use all these innovations to contemplate absolute nothingness. The irony is delicious, or at least historically interesting. Maybe you need substantial civilization before you can properly appreciate the pre-civilized state, the way you need to be very full before you can romanticize fasting. The eighth and final joke for this section involves imagining what the primordial waters would sound like if they could speak, probably just ambient ocean noise, waves and currents, maybe the occasional gurgle, which honestly would make excellent white noise for sleeping. The Sumerians accidentally invent ASMR 5,000 years before recording technology makes it possible to actually distribute soothing soundscapes for insomniacs. We've now spent approximately 5,000 words discussing the cosmic state before anything exists to discuss, which is either very profound or utterly absurd or somehow both simultaneously. The formless age defies summary because summary requires extracting key points from a larger whole, and the whole point here is that there aren't points yet, just undifferentiated unity. But we've attempted it anyway, because attempting impossible descriptions is apparently what humans do, whether in ancient Mesopotamia or modern bedrooms at whatever hour you're listening to this. The primordial waters don't remain formless forever, though forever is the wrong word for a state without temporal progression. At some point, and here we must use time words despite their inadequacy, differentiation begins. The texts describe this transition with varying mechanisms and metaphors, but they agree on the essential outcome. The singular divides into multiple, the formless takes shape, and the cosmic drama of existence begins its long, complicated performance. We're moving now from absolute beginning to relative beginning, from the unmanifest to the barely manifest, from Namu alone to Namu plus progeny. The most ancient textual traditions suggest that this division happens through a kind of spontaneous generation or self-differentiation, similar to how cells divide or how crystals form in saturated solutions. Namu doesn't so much create actively as unfold naturally, like a flower opening or a wave cresting. Within the primordial waters arise An, sky, and Ki, earth, though initially these aren't the fully separated domains we experience. They exist as potential divisions within the unity, distinctions without distance, like the horizon line where ocean meets sky, visible as a boundary but impossible to actually reach. The texts use the Sumerian word namtar, which means something like to decide, or to decree, or to determine, suggesting that creation involves a kind of cosmic decision-making, though who or what does the deciding remains deliberately ambiguous. An, whose name literally means sky or heaven, represents the principle of height, distance, transcendence, everything that rises up and away from the immediate. Kai, meaning earth, embodies the principle of solidity, immanence, that which supports and grounds. Their emergence from Namu establishes the fundamental polarity that structures all subsequent existence, up and down, far and near, celestial and terrestrial. This isn't just poetic imagery, it reflects the lived experience of being a vertical creature on a horizontal planet under a dome of sky. The Sumerians are describing reality as they perceive it, using divine genealogy to explain why the world has the structure it does. Here's where mainstream Sumerian scholarship intersects with actual archaeological evidence in satisfying ways. The temple architecture of early Mesopotamian cities directly reflects this cosmological structure. The ziggurats that begin appearing around 2100 BCE, though their precursors are much older, literally embody the Anki relationship through their design. These massive stepped pyramids bridge earth and heaven, their bases planted firmly in the terrestrial realm while their summits reach toward the celestial. The processional staircases that climb their flanks represent the pathway between realms, the connection between human and divine, the architectural manifestation of cosmic structure. Standing at the base of a ziggurat and looking up, you're experiencing the same vertical axis that the creation myths describe. Earth pulling downward, heaven pulling upward, with humanity caught in between. The practical purpose of ziggurats involves providing elevated platforms for temples, getting sacred spaces physically closer to the sky gods, but the symbolic weight of these structures exceeds their functional purpose. They remake the landscape into a cosmological diagram, transforming flat floodplain into hierarchical space. Every city that can afford one builds its own ziggurat, making each urban center into a microcosm of the entire universe, a localized reenactment of creation. The Sumerians don't just tell creation stories, they build them, inhabit them, conduct their daily lives within architectural expressions of primordial cosmic events. Now for the quirky fringe interpretation that makes serious Assyriologists sigh heavily. Certain alternative historians propose that the Anki division actually describes a planetary catastrophe, perhaps a near collision with another celestial body that altered Earth's rotation or orbital parameters. According to this view, sky and Earth separating refers not to mythological entities, but to literal astronomical events preserved in garbled cultural memory. The evidence offered typically involves creative readings of Sumerian technical terms, alleged correlations with catastrophe myths from other cultures, and a lot of speculation about ancient peoples being better astronomical observers than mainstream scholars credit them. It's the kind of theory that sounds compelling in documentary format with dramatic music but collapses under serious textual analysis. That said, it raises an interesting question: how much environmental or astronomical data might be encoded in mythology, and how would we recognize it if it were? The scholarly debate about Ananke centers on whether they should be understood as fully personalized deities or as more abstract cosmic principles that only gradually acquire personality through later theological development. Professor Jeremy Black, in his work on Sumerian religion, argues that early Mesopotamian divinity exists on a spectrum between personhood and impersonal force, with different texts and contexts emphasizing different aspects, and sometimes receives worship and offerings like any god, but sometimes functions more like a synonym for sky or heaven as physical reality. Kai appears even less personalized in most contexts, often serving as little more than the noun for earth with capital E emphasis. The distinction between divine being and natural category remains fluid, permeable, context-dependent. Imagine yourself in a Sumerian city around 2500 BCE, participating in a New Year festival that ritually reenacts creation. You're part of a procession moving through crowded streets toward the ziggurat, carrying offerings of bread and beer and dates. The priests are chanting portions of the creation mythology, their voices rising and falling in patterns that predate musical notation. Somewhere in that chanting, you hear the names An and Kai, hear the story of their separation, hear how the ordered world emerged from primordial unity. You're not analyzing this as theology or metaphysics, you're experiencing it as communal ritual, as shared cultural performance, as the story that makes your world make sense. The intellectual questions about literal versus symbolic interpretation don't concern you because you haven't been taught to separate those categories. The myth is true the way good stories are true. It reveals something about reality that factual description alone can't capture. Between An and Kai, in the space of their separation, arises Enlil, Lord Wind or Lord Air, who becomes perhaps the most important deity in the Sumerian pantheon during the 3rd millennium BCE. Enlil embodies the atmosphere, the breath, the space between sky and earth where weather happens and birds fly and human activity unfolds. His emergence represents the inhabitation of the gap, the animation of the middle realm, the arrival of active force into what had been passive polarity. Where An and Kai are relatively static, sky stays sky, earth stays earth, Enlil moves and acts and intervenes. He's the first properly dynamic god, the first deity who does things rather than just being something. Joke 1 for this section. Enlil is basically the Sumerian god of middle management, forever stuck between upper heaven and lower earth, constantly dealing with problems that originate from both directions. No wonder he develops a reputation for being irritable. The stress of maintaining cosmic order while answering to your father An and standing on your mother Ki would make anyone cranky. The texts describe Enlil as the one who separates heaven and earth, which seems redundant since they've already emerged as distinct entities, but makes sense if you understand that initial distinction as potential rather than actual separation. An and Ki exist as different principles, but they're still touching, still overlapping, still not fully independent. Enlil creates actual space between them, pushes them apart, establishes the atmosphere as a distinct realm. This separation isn't violent or traumatic in the Sumerian accounts. It's more like gentle inflation, like blowing air into a balloon that gradually expands the interior space. The sky rises, the earth settles, and between them breathes the wind. From a historical geographical perspective, Enlil's prominence reflects the climate and environment of Mesopotamia, where wind plays a crucial role in daily life. The Shamal winds that blow from the northwest bring cooler air and mark seasonal transitions. Dust storms can arise suddenly and dramatically alter visibility and livability. Wind fills sails on the rivers and canals, enabling trade and communication. Wind carries the smell of rain before storms, giving advance warning of floods. An agricultural society in this environment would naturally personify wind as divine, would naturally see atmospheric phenomena as expressions of divine will. Enlil isn't arbitrary theological invention, he's the religious expression of meteorological reality. The creation of organized space through Enki-Enlil represents humanity's first spatial technology, the ability to orient yourself vertically, to know that sky is up and earth is down and you exist in between. This seems trivially obvious to modern people, but it's actually a profound cognitive achievement that structures all subsequent understanding. We organize our metaphors vertically, rising to success, sinking to despair, our values vertically, higher virtues, lower impulses, our social hierarchies vertically, ruling from above, supporting from below. The Sumerians aren't just describing cosmic structure, they're establishing the conceptual framework that will shape human thought for millennia. Let me introduce a second joke before we sink too deep into theoretical gravity. The Sumerian creation mythology basically answers the question, what's up, with detailed theological precision. Well, An is up, obviously, and Ki is down, and Enlil is in between. Why do you ask? Ancient dad jokes encoded in cosmological literature. Once the basic spatial structure exists, sky, earth, atmosphere, the texts describe the creation of specific geographical features that define the Mesopotamian landscape. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow from the mountains in the north, bringing water and silt that enable civilization. These rivers aren't just natural features, They're divine gifts, expressions of cosmic order, the channels through which life-giving water reaches the otherwise arid plains. The marshlands in the south, where fresh river water meets salt water from the Gulf, become sites of tremendous biodiversity and economic importance. The date palms that provide food, fiber, and building materials receive divine sanction. The barley fields that feed the population get incorporated into creation mythology. Everything important in the physical environment finds reflection in the divine genealogy. The next generation of gods begins multiplying through various mechanisms, some through sexual reproduction. The texts can be quite frank about divine sexuality, some through apparently asexual generation, some through mysterious processes that the scribes don't bother explaining. What matters is that divine plurality increases, that the pantheon expands, that different deities come to embody different aspects of reality and human experience. We get Enki, or Ea, god of sweet water and wisdom and magic, associated with the underground aquifer that supplies wells and springs. We get Ninhursag, mother goddess associated with birth and vegetation. We get Nana, the moon god, and Utu, the sun god, establishing the celestial bodies as divine entities worthy of worship and study. Here's where things get interesting from a labor relations perspective. The gods, despite their power and immortality, have to maintain the cosmos through constant work. The rivers need dredging to prevent silting. The irrigation canals require cleaning and repair. The fields must be plowed and planted and harvested. Temple maintenance alone involves staggering effort: cleaning, feeding the divine statues, performing daily rituals, managing agricultural estates that support the religious infrastructure. In early versions of the mythology, the gods themselves perform all this labor, and they're not particularly happy about it. Divine grumbling about endless toil becomes a recurring theme, which strikes me as both amusing and psychologically realistic. Even deathless cosmic entities apparently experience workplace dissatisfaction. The Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian text from around 1700 BCE that preserves older Sumerian traditions, describes this divine labor crisis in detail. The junior gods, the Igigi, are assigned all the hard physical work: digging canals, maintaining waterways, hauling earth and stone. They do this for thousands of years. The text says 40 years initially, but Mesopotamian literature loves symbolic numbers, and 40 often means a really long time. Finally, they rebel. They burn their tools, surround Enlil's temple, and demand relief from their endless toil. It's history's first labor strike, conducted by deities before humans even exist to witness it. Joke 3. Imagine being a junior god on canal digging duty for several millennia and finally having enough. That's it, I'm unionizing. Who's with me? The solidarity among exploited divine workers apparently exceeds anything modern labor organizers have achieved. Also, the fact that even gods need unions says something profound about the inevitability of workplace conflict. The Divine Assembly meets to address this crisis, with Enlil presiding in his role as executive authority. Various solutions get proposed and debated in scenes that sound remarkably like tense board meetings or parliamentary sessions. Someone suggests just forcing the Igigi back to work, but that seems likely to provoke further rebellion. Someone else suggests destroying the rebellious gods and starting over, which raises questions about who would then do the necessary labor. Eventually, Enki, the clever god of wisdom, proposes an elegant solution: create a new class of beings specifically designed for work. These beings will be mortal, so individual deaths don't matter much, prolific, so the population can be replenished, and just intelligent enough to follow instructions without being smart enough to effectively rebel. These beings, of course, are humans. The creation of humanity in Mesopotamian mythology has nothing to do with divine love or desire for worship or cosmic loneliness. It's a labor relations solution to a divine management problem. We're created to work, to maintain the cosmic order, to perform the tedious tasks that even gods find burdensome. This rather deflating origin story contrasts sharply with other cultural traditions that imagine humanity as the pinnacle of creation or the beloved children of benevolent deities. The Sumerians look around at their backbreaking agricultural lifestyle, their constant struggle against floods and droughts and soil exhaustion, and conclude, yes, this makes sense. We were literally designed for this misery. From a mainstream historical perspective, this mythology clearly reflects the social structure of actual Sumerian cities. The gods in their temples mirror the human aristocracy and priesthood. The working gods mirror the peasant agricultural class, and the creation of humans to serve divine interests mirrors the way actual humans serve the interests of temple estates and royal households. The mythology doesn't critique this arrangement, it sanctifies it, makes it cosmically necessary, removes any possibility of imagining alternatives. If the gods themselves require servant workers, then obviously human kings and priests require the same. The social order becomes indistinguishable from the cosmic order. But here's a delightfully subversive fringe interpretation that probably tells us more about modern anxieties than ancient Sumerian thought. Some alternative theorists read the Igigi rebellion and human creation as evidence of ancient genetic engineering by extraterrestrial visitors. According to this view, the gods were actually technologically advanced aliens. The labor was mining or construction projects, and the creation of humans involved genetic manipulation of existing hominids to produce a slave species. The evidence for this interpretation consists mostly of willful misreadings of translation choices and enthusiastic ignorance about how ancient languages actually work. It's Erich von Däniken-style ancient astronaut theory, which has been thoroughly debunked by actual scholars but persists because it offers a dramatic narrative more exciting than agricultural societies personify natural forces and social structures as gods. The scholarly debate about human creation centers on a more subtle question. How literally did ancient Mesopotamians believe these accounts? Did they think the first humans were actually molded from clay mixed with divine blood, as some versions describe, or did they understand this as poetic metaphor for humanity's dual nature, earthly body, divine breath? We don't have access to ancient Mesopotamian epistemology, so we project our own distinctions between literal and metaphorical onto their texts and hope we're not completely wrong. My own suspicion is that they didn't sharply divide these categories the way post-Enlightenment moderns do, that they could believe something was both literally true and symbolically meaningful without seeing any contradiction. The actual process of human creation varies across different textual traditions, but a common version involves the goddess Nintu, also called Mami or Belet Ili, mixing clay from the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean, with the blood of a slaughtered god. The divine blood provides intelligence and vitality. The clay provides physical substance. She shapes this mixture into human forms, speaks incantations over them, and they become living beings. The number created varies, sometimes 7 pairs, sometimes 14 individuals, the specific count less important than the principle of providing enough workers to solve the divine labor shortage. Joke 4. The Mesopotamian creation of humanity involves arts and crafts with deity blood, which sounds like the most intense pottery class ever offered. Today, we're working with clay and cosmic essence. Please don't get any on your robes. Divine bloodstains are impossible to remove. The sensory details of this creation scene, as imagined by listeners in ancient temples, would have been vivid and familiar. Everyone in an agricultural society knows what fresh clay feels like. Cool, slightly grainy, plastic under pressure, drying to crumbly hardness if left exposed to air. Everyone has shaped mud into bricks or pottery, understands the satisfying responsiveness of the material. Blood, too, is familiar from animal sacrifice, from butchering, from injury and childbirth. Its heat, its color, its transformation from liquid to solid as it dries. These are everyday experiences repurposed in sacred narrative. The creation of humanity isn't abstract theology, it's divine kitchen work using familiar ingredients. Once humanity exists, the gods celebrate and assign human beings their purpose, worship and service. Humans will build temples, perform sacrifices, offer prayers and praise, and most importantly, maintain the irrigation systems and agricultural infrastructure that keep the world functioning. In exchange, the gods promise to provide what humans need for survival: rain in due season, flooding that deposits fertile silt, protection from enemies and wild animals. It's a transactional relationship, a kind of cosmic employment contract. Humans work, gods protect and provide. Mutual obligation rather than pure domination, though obviously the power dynamics heavily favor the divine employers. This understanding of human purpose explains the enormous importance of temple service in Mesopotamian society, working in temple fields, maintaining temple canals, providing offerings to divine statues. These aren't optional religious activities for especially pious individuals. They're humanity's essential function, the reason we exist at all. Shirking temple duty isn't just personally irresponsible, it's a kind of cosmic treason, a betrayal of the fundamental human purpose. This theological framework provides powerful ideological support for the temple institutions that control vast agricultural wealth and require massive labor inputs. From a more sympathetic perspective, this worldview also provides dignity to agricultural labor that other cultures might denigrate. If you're digging irrigation ditches not just for economic necessity but in fulfillment of cosmic purpose, if your backbreaking toil participates in the maintenance of universal order, then your work has meaning beyond its immediate material returns. The peasant cleaning a canal performs the same essential task that the junior gods once performed, connecting human action to divine precedent. There's something almost beautiful in that, even as we recognize its function as ideological control. The fifth joke for this section involves imagining the first performance review in cosmic history. Humanity, you've been working for us for several thousand years now. Your productivity is acceptable, but we're concerned about your tendency toward independent thinking and occasional rebellion. Also, you don't live as long as we'd hoped, and your failure rate is quite high. On the plus side, you breed quickly and require minimal training. Overall rating, adequate. The gods as middle managers, humanity as disposable contract workers. As human civilization develops in these mythological accounts, different cities receive patronage from different deities, establishing the pattern of civic gods that dominates Mesopotamian religion for millennia. Eridu belongs to Enki, the wise god of the sweet water abyss. Uruk belongs to An and to Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Nippur belongs to Enlil, making it the most important religious center despite not always being the largest or wealthiest city. Ur belongs to Nana, the moon god. Each city becomes a divine household, its human population serving as the god's domestic staff, maintaining the divine estate and providing for the deity's needs. This distributed divine governance reflects the political reality of early Sumerian history. No unified empire, but rather a collection of independent city-states, sometimes cooperating, often competing, occasionally warring with each other. The gods provide ideological justification for this fragmentation. Each city has its own cosmic patron, its own divine mandate, its own particular relationship to the sacred. Political unification under a single ruler requires theological innovation, developing concepts like kingship that transcend individual city loyalties, creating bureaucratic structures that supersede local divine allegiances. Let me introduce scholarly debate number 6. How much of this divine city-state system represents genuine ancient Sumerian religion versus later Babylonian systematization? The tablets we possess mostly come from later periods, when scribes are trying to organize and preserve older traditions that they inherited in fragmentary, contradictory forms. Some scholars argue that the neat assignment of specific gods to specific cities reflects librarian tidiness more than religious reality, that actual practice was always messier, with overlapping divine jurisdictions and competing theological claims. Others maintain that the city god pattern is genuinely ancient, rooted in the earliest urban settlements, preserved accurately in later texts, despite the temporal distance. Imagine yourself as a citizen of Uruk around 2700 BCE, when the city is emerging as a major power. Your patron deities are An, the distant sky god, and Inanna, the passionate goddess of love and warfare. The contradiction between remote cosmic authority and immediate emotional intensity mirrors the city's own character, simultaneously reaching toward heaven through architectural ambition, the ziggurat under construction in the sacred district, and deeply engaged with earthly pleasures and conflicts, the bustling markets, the competitive politics, the occasional military adventures. You participate in festivals honoring both deities, But it's Inanna who captures imagination and devotion, Inanna whose myths are recited and reenacted, Inanna who feels personally present in the life of the community. The creation mythology continues to unfold through lists of antediluvian kings, rulers who supposedly reigned before the Great Flood that serves as the major chronological dividing line in Mesopotamian historical thinking. The Sumerian king list, a remarkable document that attempts to catalogue every ruler from the beginning of time, starts with the line, "When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu." This single sentence encodes profound theological claims. Legitimate political authority comes from the gods, not from human consensus or military strength. The first king rules in Eridu, the oldest city, sacred to Enki, establishing a connection between primordial creation and political governance. The king list then provides reigns of absurd length for these early monarchs, tens of thousands of years each, numbers that clearly aren't meant to be historical in the modern sense. Alulim of Eridu supposedly rules for 28,800 years, Alalgar for 36,000 years. 8 kings total before the flood, with combined reigns adding up to 241,200 years. What are we to make of these impossible numbers? One interpretation suggests they represent a kind of deep time, an acknowledgement that the distance to origins exceeds normal human reckoning. Another suggests they're the result of confusion between different numbering systems or calendrical schemes. A third notes that extremely long lifespans for primordial figures appear in many cultural traditions, biblical patriarchs, Taoist immortals, Indian rishis, suggesting some common psychological need to imagine a golden age when humans lived longer, knew more, stood closer to the sacred. Joke 7. The antediluvian kings of Sumer make our modern politicians look positively sprightly in comparison. Sure, Senator so-and-so has been in office for 40 years, but that's nothing compared to King Alulim's 28,000-year administration. Now that's political entrenchment. The lifestyle of these mythical early kings supposedly involves direct interaction with gods, perfect climate, abundant harvests, no disease or warfare. It's a golden age narrative, a time when the separation between divine and human realms is less absolute, when the proper order established at creation hasn't yet been corrupted by human failing. This narrative pattern, primordial perfection, gradual decline, eventual catastrophe requiring divine reset, appears across many mythological systems and probably reflects genuine psychological patterns in how humans process historical change and cultural anxiety. From a materialist historical perspective, what's interesting about these kingship myths is less their literal claims and more what they reveal about later Mesopotamian political ideology. By the time these traditions are being written down and systematized, kingship has become the normal form of government, so retroactively inserting kings into the very beginning of post-creation time naturalizes monarchy as cosmic necessity. There can be no imagining of legitimate human community without kings, because kings have existed since the gods first decided humans needed organizing. This is propaganda in the deepest sense, not crude lies, but the structuring of reality itself to support particular power arrangements. Yet even propaganda can preserve interesting historical kernels. The locations mentioned in the king list, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larag, Sipar, Shurupak, are real archaeological sites where human occupation stretches back to very early periods. These aren't random mythical locations, but actual places where the first urban experiments occurred. The texts conflate myth and geography, legend and landscape, in ways that make simple dismissal inappropriate. Something historical haunts these mythological king lists, even if extracting it requires careful methodological attention. The eighth and final joke for this section: if you've ever complained about your commute or your work hours, remember that according to Sumerian mythology, your distant ancestors were literally created to do the backbreaking labor that even gods found too tedious to continue. So in a sense, all employment is improvement from that baseline. At least my job doesn't involve eternal canal dredging at divine gunpoint is a pretty low bar for workplace satisfaction, but technically it's progress. As we conclude this section on when gods shaped the first land and created humans to maintain it, we've moved from formless unity to structured plurality, from potential to actuality, from cosmic stasis to divine drama. The world now has geography, hierarchy, inhabitants, and purpose. Gods require worship and service. Humans provide both while pursuing their brief mortal lives. The stage is set for the complex interactions between divine and human realms that will occupy the rest of Mesopotamian history. We've transitioned from creation proper to the earliest organization of created reality, from Genesis to government, from let there be to here's how things work. With humans created and cities established and gods ruling from their temples, the next phase of mythological history involves the mysterious transmission of civilization itself, the knowledge and skills that transform scattered agricultural villages into complex urban societies. The Sumerians attribute this transformation to the Apkallu, the 7 sages who emerge from the sea during the antediluvian period to teach humanity the arts of civilization. These beings represent one of the most intriguing elements in Mesopotamian mythology, entities that don't fit neatly into the categories of gods or humans, but occupy some liminal space between realms. The word Apkallu combines ab, water, and gal, great or big. So we might translate it as great water beings, or sea sages. The texts describe them as having human heads and bodies but with fish-like lower portions or fish cloaks, images that survive in later Assyrian palace reliefs showing winged genies with fish costumes performing protective rituals. These are creatures of the boundary, the threshold, the space between water and land where transformation occurs. They come from the Abzu, the freshwater ocean that exists beneath the Earth's surface, the realm of Enki, god of wisdom and magic. Their arrival represents the gift of divine knowledge to humanity, though the mechanism and motivation for this gift remain somewhat obscure. The primary Apkallu, the first and most important of the 7, is Adapa, also called Uan or Oans in later Greek sources. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 300 BCE, provides a famous description. There appeared from the sea a creature endowed with reason, named Oans, whose whole body was that of a fish, but under the fish's head there was another head, and human feet emerged from the fish's tail. He had a human voice, and his image is preserved to this day. This being spent the days with humans, teaching them writing and mathematics and every kind of art, how to build cities and found temples, how to establish laws and survey land. He taught them seeds and gathering of fruits, in short, everything that makes life civilized. And when the sun set, this being would return to the sea and spend the nights in the deep, for he was amphibious. Imagine standing on the marshy shore of the Persian Gulf around 3500 BCE, at least in mythological chronology, watching this bizarre figure emerge from the waves. The sun is setting, painting the water orange and gold, and there's this being that's simultaneously familiar and alien, human and fish, terrestrial and aquatic. He speaks your language but comes from unimaginable depths. He carries knowledge from the gods but delivers it in comprehensible terms. The psychological impact of such an encounter, if we take the myth as encoding some genuine historical memory however distorted, would be profound. Even as pure fiction, the image resonates. Wisdom comes from the depths, from beneath surface awareness, from sources we can't fully access or understand. From a mainstream archaeological perspective, the development of Sumerian civilization shows clear evidence of gradual local development, rather than sudden importation of complete cultural package. Pottery styles evolve continuously from earlier periods. Agricultural techniques develop through incremental innovation. Writing emerges from pre-literate accounting systems over several centuries. Architectural forms show obvious continuity with earlier building practices. There's no archaeological evidence for a moment when complete civilization arrives from outside, no sharp break that would suggest external intervention. The Apkallu mythology, then, functions as explanatory narrative for a process that actually unfolded gradually over many generations, the personification and dramatization of cultural evolution. But here's where the fringe interpretations get wonderfully weird. Some alternative historians propose that the Apkallu represent actual contact with non-human intelligence, either extraterrestrial visitors or survivors of an earlier lost civilization. Atlantis gets mentioned a lot in this context. The amphibious nature of the beings gets read as describing spacesuits or diving equipment. Their gift of sudden knowledge supports theories about cultural transfer from advanced precursor societies. The 7 sages become 7 alien teachers, or 7 Atlantean refugees, or 7 time travelers, depending on which version of alternative history you prefer. The evidence consists mainly of the argument that ancient peoples couldn't have developed civilization on their own, which is both unsupported by archaeology and rather insulting to ancient human ingenuity. The scholarly debate about the Apkallu centers on their relationship to the Mesopotamian priestcraft and scribal traditions. Some scholars, including Wilfrid Lambert, argue that the 7 sages represent idealized founding figures for the scribal profession, mythological ancestors that give prestige and ancient pedigree to the work of writing, calculation, and ritual knowledge. Each sage supposedly serves as advisor to one of the antediluvian kings, establishing the pattern of wise counselor to royal power that continues throughout Mesopotamian history. Other scholars emphasize the Apkallu's connection to Enki and see them as embodiments of divine wisdom made accessible to humans, messenger figures who translate cosmic knowledge into human language and practice. The 7 Apkallu have individual names, though these vary across different textual traditions. The standard list includes Uan or Adapa, Wanduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, and Utuabzu. Some texts associate each sage with a specific king and city, others present them as a collective appearing together. What they teach forms the foundation of Mesopotamian high culture: writing, cuneiform, mathematics, the sexagesimal system still reflected in our 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles, astronomy, careful observation and prediction of celestial phenomena, architecture, temple building and city planning, agriculture, irrigation technology and crop management, law, the earliest law codes claim divine sanction, and religious ritual, the proper worship of gods through sacrifice and ceremony. Joke 1 for this section. Imagine being a regular Sumerian farmer and having a fish person emerge from the sea to teach you calculus. But I just want to grow barley. Too bad. You're learning base 60 number systems whether you like it or not. The Apkallu, as the world's most insistent tutors, absolutely determine that humanity will develop civilization even if nobody asked for it. The connection between wisdom and water runs deep in Mesopotamian thought, deeper than the Apkallu alone suggest. Enki, as mentioned, rules the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth that feeds springs and rivers. He's the god of wisdom, magic, crafts, and creative intelligence. His temple in Eridu sits above the Abzu, with ritual pools that represent connection to those cosmic depths. Drinking water from the Abzu imparts knowledge, bathing in it provides purification and renewal. The metaphor works multiple ways. Water is necessary for life, wisdom is necessary for civilization. Both come from hidden depths, both must be properly channeled to be useful rather than destructive. The specific knowledge the Apkallu impart includes what the Sumerians call me, pronounced may, a concept that's difficult to translate directly into English but refers to the fundamental aspects, powers, or essences that make civilization possible. There are supposedly over 100 me, ranging from practical crafts like carpentry and metalworking to abstract concepts like kingship, justice, and even sexual intercourse. The me aren't just skills or knowledge, they're more like cosmic principles or essential attributes that must be properly maintained and transmitted. Possessing the me makes you civilized, lacking them makes you barbarous. The Apkallu serve as the original transmitters of me from the divine realm to humanity. One famous myth, Inanna and Enki, describes how the goddess Inanna tricks the drunk Enki into giving her many of the me, which she then brings to her city of Uruk. This story, dating to the early dynastic period around 2500 BCE, suggests some competition, or at least dynamic tension, around who controls civilizational knowledge. Enki, keeper of wisdom, gets outwitted by clever Inanna, who wants cultural prestige for her city. The me become portable, transferable, subject to political maneuvering even among gods. This reflects actual historical competition between Sumerian cities for cultural and religious preeminence, but it also raises interesting questions about whether wisdom can or should be monopolized versus freely shared. The sensory experience of learning from the Apkallu, if we imaginatively reconstruct it from the mythological perspective, would involve both familiarity and strangeness. They teach in human language, use human tools, work with materials readily available in the Mesopotamian environment, but they bring techniques and insights from beyond human experience, from the divine realm accessed through Enki's underwater kingdom. Watching an Apkallu demonstrate how to make a clay tablet, mix ink, press a stylus to create the wedge marks of cuneiform, it would feel like watching magic become mundane, like divine mystery crystallizing into practicable skill. Joke 2. The Apkallu invented writing specifically so that there would be homework, making them history's greatest villains from the perspective of students everywhere. Congratulations, humanity! You can now preserve information across generations and develop cumulative knowledge. Also, you have to practice your cuneiform signs until your hands cramp. You're welcome. From a practical historical standpoint, the actual transmission of technical knowledge in ancient Mesopotamia occurred through apprenticeship systems, craft guilds, scribal schools, and family trades passed parent to child. The aduba, or tablet house where scribal students learned their craft, involved years of rote memorization, countless practice tablets, strict discipline, and gradual advancement through standardized curricula. It was rigorous, demanding work that produced literacy rates probably well under 5% of the population. The Apkallu mythology provides a more exciting origin story than lots of people worked really hard for several generations to incrementally develop these skills. But the reality has its own impressiveness. The seven sages appear not just at the beginning of time, but continue to influence Mesopotamian history through later periods. Some traditions suggest that after the flood, which we'll discuss shortly, a new set of sages appears, though these are explicitly human rather than divine human hybrids. The post-flood sages include famous legendary figures like Gilgamesh and legendary scribes and wise men. This suggests a pattern where divine-human collaboration in the primordial age transitions to purely human achievement in historical time, with divine influence becoming more indirect, more mediated through tradition and established practice. The third scholarly debate for this section concerns the relationship between the Apkallu mythology and actual Mesopotamian intellectual history. Did the Sumerians and their Akkadian successors genuinely believe in a golden age of divine wisdom teachers, or did they understand these figures as metaphorical personifications of cultural development? The textual evidence allows both readings. Some passages treat the Apkallu as straightforward historical entities, others seem more allegorical. The problem, as always, is that we can't interview ancient Mesopotamians about their epistemology, their theory of knowledge and belief. We're stuck with texts that may be literal, may be metaphorical, may be both depending on context and audience. Imagine participating in a ritual at Eridu's temple to Enki, perhaps around 2300 BCE, when the city is no longer politically dominant but remains religiously significant. The priests perform a ceremony honoring the Apkallu, reciting the list of their names and accomplishments. You're standing in a courtyard with dozens of other worshippers, the smell of incense mixing with the marsh scent carried by evening breezes. The ritual connects you to the mythological past, to the moment when wisdom first entered the world, to the source of everything that makes civilized life possible. Whether you believe the Apkallu were literally fishmen or understand them as symbolic representations matters less than the psychological and social function of the ritual. Binding community through shared narrative, honoring knowledge and learning, acknowledging debt to the past. The Apkallu's amphibious nature carries symbolic weight beyond just being weird imagery. They mediate between realms, water and land, divine and human, knowledge and ignorance. This liminality makes them perfect vehicles for transformation, for the movement of wisdom from one domain to another. Anthropologically, threshold figures appear across many cultural traditions. tricksters, shamans, psychopomps, teachers, beings who can cross boundaries others cannot, who translate between incompatible systems of meaning. The fish-human sages fit this pattern perfectly. Joke 3. The Apkallu's need to return to the sea every night suggests they have terrible landlord situations. Sorry, I'd love to continue teaching you the principles of hydraulic engineering, but I need to get back to my underwater apartment before the sun sets, or I dry out. Same time tomorrow? Cosmic wisdom on a strict schedule. One particularly interesting Apkallu story involves Adapa, the first and greatest of the sages. In the Adapa and the South Wind myth, Adapa goes fishing but gets capsized by the south wind, so he curses it and breaks its wings, causing the wind to stop blowing for 7 days. Anu, the sky god, summons Adapa to heaven to explain this disruption of cosmic order. Enki, Adapa's patron, warns him that Anu will offer him the food and water of death, which he must refuse. But when Adapa reaches heaven, Anu is actually impressed by his wisdom and offers him the food and water of immortality instead. Following Enki's instructions, Adapa refuses, and thereby loses the chance for humanity to become immortal. He returns to Earth, having maintained his mortality and by extension, humanity's mortality. This myth encapsulates several important Mesopotamian themes. The double-edged nature of wisdom. Adapa is wise enough to reach heaven, but not wise enough to recognize when to disobey his teacher. The permanence of death. Even the wisest humans can't escape mortality, and the ambiguous relationship between gods and humans. Is Anu testing Adapa? Is Enki protecting him from a trick or unintentionally dooming him? It's a sophisticated narrative that resists simple moral readings, leaving interpreters to argue about what it really means. From one perspective, the story explains why humans must die while gods live forever. We had our chance for immortality and blew it through excessive obedience. From another angle, it suggests that immortality would actually be a burden, a trap, and Enki protects Adapa from accepting it. A third reading emphasizes the tragic gap between human wisdom and divine knowledge. We can never quite close that distance, never quite achieve complete understanding. The myth works on multiple levels simultaneously, which is probably why it gets copied and recopied for over 1,000 years. The fourth debate among scholars centers on the flood's relationship to the Apkallu narrative. In later Babylonian versions, the seventh sage Utuabzu is blamed for angering the gods and causing the flood through some transgression. The texts aren't specific about what exactly he did wrong. This makes the sages somewhat ambiguous figures, benefactors who give civilization but also dangerous beings whose actions can provoke divine wrath. Other traditions don't connect the Apkallu to the flood at all, presenting them as purely positive figures. The variation suggests different theological schools working through complicated questions about the relationship between divine wisdom, human knowledge, and cosmic catastrophe. Let me paint a sensory scene of antediluvian life as the Mesopotamians might have imagined it, the era when Apkallu walked among humans. The cities are smaller than they'll become later, more like large towns, their mud brick buildings gleaming white with lime plaster. The canals are pristine, recently dug, flowing with perfect efficiency. The marshes teem with fish and waterfowl. The fields produce abundant harvests without salt accumulation or soil exhaustion. The climate is mild, stable, perfectly balanced. Kings rule with wisdom inherited from divine counselors. Priests perform rituals exactly as the gods prescribed. There's no warfare, no famine, no plague. It's paradise not through luxury, but through perfect order, everything functioning as it should. Of course, this idealized past probably never existed. Archaeological evidence shows that early Mesopotamian urban life involved considerable hardship, violence, disease, and social conflict. But the mythological vision serves psychological functions regardless of historical accuracy. It provides a standard against which to measure the present. We've declined from ancient perfection. An explanation for current problems. We've lost the wisdom of the Apkallu, and a hope for future restoration. Perhaps we can recover what was lost. Utopian thinking often manifests as nostalgic rather than futuristic in pre-modern cultures. Joke 4. The Apkallu basically showed up, taught humanity all the important skills in one concentrated period, then disappeared forever, making them the ultimate adjunct professors. Here's the complete foundation of civilization. I'll be available for office hours never. Good luck with everything. I'm going back to the ocean. No wonder humans still seem confused about how things work. The transmission of knowledge through the Apkallu raises questions about intellectual property that the ancient Mesopotamians probably never formulated explicitly but that lurk in the mythology. Do humans have a right to divine wisdom, or is it a gift that can be revoked? When Inanna steals the me from Enki, is she performing a legitimate acquisition or an illegitimate theft? When later human sages develop new knowledge, are they discovering something that already exists in the divine realm or creating something genuinely new? The texts don't provide clear answers, but they show ancient thinkers grappling with questions about the source and ownership of knowledge that remain relevant today. The architectural knowledge attributed to the Apkallu becomes concrete in the ziggurats and temples that define Mesopotamian cityscapes. The complex mathematics required to build these structures, calculating volume, ensuring structural stability, organizing large labor forces, managing resources, represents considerable intellectual achievement. Whether actually taught by fishmen or developed through human ingenuity over many generations, this knowledge transforms the landscape and makes possible the urban density that characterizes civilization. You can visit the ruins of these structures today, touch the bricks that Sumerian workers made and placed according to Sumerian mathematical principles, and experience directly the material legacy of this ancient wisdom. The fifth joke: if you've ever had trouble learning a new skill and wished an expert would just download the knowledge directly into your brain, the Mesopotamians got there first with the Apkallu mythology. Civilization as direct transfer from divine realm to human brain. No tedious practice required, except of course everyone still had to practice their cuneiform for years in scribal school, so maybe the knowledge transfer wasn't quite as efficient as advertised. As this section draws toward conclusion, having explored the mysterious arrival of forbidden or at least carefully guarded knowledge, we might reflect on how contemporary readers encounter these myths. We're separated from their original context by vast chronological and cultural distance, reading translations of translations, interpreting through frameworks the original authors never imagined. The Apkallu that emerge from our mental reconstruction of ancient Mesopotamia are inevitably colored by our own assumptions about wisdom, education, cultural transmission. We can't help but project ourselves into the gaps in our knowledge, yet something in these stories resists complete appropriation, maintains its alien quality, refuses to be domesticated into modern sensibility. The image of fish people teaching civilization preserves a weird sublimity that no amount of scholarly contextualization entirely dissolves. These are genuinely strange myths, products of a worldview radically different from modern Western rationalism, and that strangeness has value. It reminds us that human imagination encompasses possibilities we haven't exhausted, that the deep past contains cognitive and cultural diversity we can barely reconstruct. The sixth debate in Apkallu scholarship concerns whether these figures represent a distinct Mesopotamian tradition, or whether they share origins with wisdom bringers from other ancient Near Eastern cultures. The Egyptian god Thoth, the Greek Prometheus, various other divine or semi-divine culture heroes who bring knowledge to humanity, do these share a common mythological ancestor, or do they represent independent developments of similar archetypal patterns? The comparative mythology approach suggests universal human needs generate similar narrative solutions. The diffusionist approach suggests cultural contact and transmission. The evidence probably supports some combination of both processes. Imagine yourself as a scribe in training, perhaps 12 years old, sitting cross-legged on a mat in the tablet house, your practice tablet on your lap, your stylus in hand. The master recites the names of the 7 Apkallu, and you must write them correctly, forming each sign with the proper number and angle of wedges. Your hands are sore from hours of practice. Your eyes ache from focusing on tiny marks. But you're learning to do what the sages first taught humanity thousands of years ago, to capture thought in physical form, to make meaning persist beyond memory, to participate in the great project of civilization. The mythological past becomes immediate, personal, relevant. The seventh joke for this section imagines the Apkallu trying to teach mathematics to a humanity that hasn't asked for it and doesn't particularly want it. But why do I need to know that a circle has 360 degrees? Because we said so. We came from the cosmic ocean with this knowledge, and you're going to learn it. Now calculate the area of this field, or we're going back to the sea and taking all the useful skills with us. Aggressive educational interventions by amphibious wisdom beings. The final scholarly point worth noting, the Apkallu tradition shows remarkable longevity, appearing in texts from the 3rd millennium BCE through the 1st millennium, spanning most of Mesopotamian history. Later Assyrian kings claimed to have access to Apkallu wisdom, describing their own advisors as possessing knowledge from the antediluvian sages. Ritual texts invoke the Apkallu for protection against evil spirits and disease. The mythology remains productive, generating new meanings and applications across changing historical circumstances. This persistence suggests the stories successfully capture something psychologically resonant about the nature and origin of cultural knowledge. The eighth and final joke, the Apkallu, are basically the ancient Mesopotamian equivalent of that one friend who travels extensively and won't stop telling you about all the amazing things they learned abroad. Well, when I was in the cosmic ocean learning divine wisdom, yes, Adapa, we know, you've mentioned it several hundred times, your fish costume isn't even that impressive. Modern scholars perform similar function when we lecture about ancient Mesopotamia to anyone who will listen, so perhaps we're all spiritual descendants of the Apkallu in our own annoying way. As we close this section on the 7 sages and forbidden knowledge, we've moved from the establishment of cosmic order to the transmission of cultural knowledge, from divine creativity to human learning, from mythological origins to the threshold of something approaching history. The world now contains not just humans but civilized humans, not just life but cultured life, not just existence but meaningful existence structured by knowledge, law, art, and religion. The Apkallu have done their work and returned to the depths, leaving humanity with tools and wisdom to forge its own path. The antediluvian age, that long stretch of mythological time when gods walked the earth and sages taught civilization and impossible kings reigned for millennia, eventually comes to an end through cosmic catastrophe, the great flood that wipes away the early world and necessitates a new beginning. But before we reach that deluge, we need to understand the development of kingship itself, the institution through which gods exercise authority over humans and humans organize their collective life. The texts tell us that kingship was lowered from heaven, suggesting divine origin for political authority, but they also show kingship emerging from very human needs for coordination, defense, and large-scale resource management. The earliest Sumerian cities operate through a system scholars sometimes call primitive democracy, though that's probably too generous a term for what's actually a council-based oligarchy where temple officials and prosperous citizens make collective decisions. Around 3000 BCE, as cities grow larger and more complex, as irrigation systems require more coordination, as competition between cities increases, we see the emergence of individual rulers with greater centralized authority. The Sumerian word lugal, literally big man, comes to designate these rulers, though initially they're probably more like successful war leaders or particularly influential administrators than absolute monarchs. The city of Uruk, under its legendary king Gilgamesh, represents the transitional period when kingship is becoming institutionalized but hasn't yet achieved the cosmic sanction it will claim in later periods. Gilgamesh, who probably was a historical ruler around 2700 BCE, though everything we know about him comes from much later legendary sources, appears in mythology as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a hybrid being who bridges divine and mortal realms. His epic adventures, preserved in what becomes the world's first great work of literature, explore themes of friendship, mortality, the search for meaning, and the limits of human achievement even for semi-divine heroes. Joke 1 for this section. Gilgamesh being 2/3 god creates mathematical problems that Sumerian scribes probably argued about during slow days at the tablet house. How can you be 2/3 of one thing and 1/3 of another? That's not how fractions work. Look, the gods made him. Take it up with them if you don't like the proportions. Divine genetics apparently operates on different mathematical principles than everything else. The mainstream historical understanding of early Sumerian kingship emphasizes its development as a response to practical needs, organizing large-scale irrigation projects, coordinating defense against external threats, managing surplus agricultural production, conducting trade with distant regions, and mediating disputes between individuals and families. Kings emerge because urban complexity exceeds the management capacity of informal or distributed authority structures. The earliest royal inscriptions we possess focus heavily on practical achievements, building canals, constructing temples, defeating enemies, ensuring just weights and measures. These are administrators claiming legitimacy through effective management. But the mythology transforms practical political development into cosmic drama. Kingship doesn't emerge gradually from human social evolution. It descends complete from heaven, a divine gift or imposition depending on perspective. The gods meet in assembly and decide that humans require kings to maintain order and ensure proper worship. Specific cities receive kingship for defined periods, another function of the king list, creating a pattern where divine favor shifts between urban centers, explaining why political power moves around rather than remaining permanently concentrated in one location. This theological explanation sanctifies the political reality of city-state competition while also constraining royal authority. Kings rule by divine favor, which can be withdrawn if they fail to satisfy divine requirements. The third scholarly debate for this section addresses whether we should understand early Mesopotamian kingship as primarily religious or political in nature. Walter Burkert and others argue that the distinction between religious and political authority is anachronistic when applied to ancient Near Eastern cultures, that kings function simultaneously as political rulers and religious mediators, that separating these roles reflects modern sensibilities rather than ancient realities. Other scholars maintain that we can identify genuinely political dimensions to kingship, military leadership, judicial authority, economic management, that are distinct from purely religious functions even if often intertwined with them. Imagine yourself in Uruk around 2600 BCE, during the reign of one of Gilgamesh's successors. You're standing in the massive courtyard of the temple district, surrounded by thousands of other citizens, watching a coronation ceremony. The new king, whose name you probably won't remember in a few years because the really famous kings are rare, ascends a platform. Priests perform elaborate rituals involving anointment, symbolic weapons, ceremonial regalia. The king pledges to maintain the god's temples, ensure justice for citizens, defend the city from enemies. In return, the priests declare divine favor and legitimate authority. The crowd roars approval, not because you've individually chosen this ruler, but because the ceremony successfully channels collective anxiety about succession into structured celebration. You're witnessing the transformation of a human being into an institution, a person into a king. The sensory details of such ceremonies, reconstructed from fragmentary textual references and temple architecture, involve overwhelming scale and sensory intensity. Thousands of people crowded into confined spaces, the smell of bodies and incense and animal sacrifice, the sound of drums and chanting echoing off mud brick walls, the visual spectacle of elaborate costumes and precious metals and controlled flame. These ceremonies aren't quiet private rituals, but massive public performances designed to impress and awe, to make divine authority tangible, to bind community through shared spectacular experience. The psychology is sophisticated, make kingship sacred through sensory overload, through beauty and terror and mystery. The cities that receive kingship according to the Sumerian king list include Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larag, Sippar, and Shuruppak before the flood. Each city's period of dominance supposedly involves multiple kings with extremely long reigns, preserving the pattern of deep mythological time rather than historical chronology. After the flood, the list continues with dynasties in Kish, Uruk, Awan, and many other cities, eventually reaching rulers whose reigns approximate normal human lifespans and who appear in other documentary sources, suggesting we're transitioning from pure myth to legendary history to something approaching actual history. This gradual movement from clearly mythological to possibly historical reveals something important about Mesopotamian historical consciousness. They don't sharply divide mythological past from historical present the way post-Enlightenment moderns do. The past forms a continuum from cosmic creation through cultural foundation, through legendary heroes, through remembered ancestors to the current moment. All of it is real. The mode of reality might differ, but there's no absolute epistemological break. The gods who created the world are the same gods who receive worship in contemporary temples. The kings who ruled in mythological antiquity are the predecessors of current monarchs. Time is continuous, even if its quality changes. Joke 2. The Sumerian king list is basically ancient Mesopotamia's longest resume, starting with experience 200 years of pre-flood leadership and ending with currently available for short-term contracts 32 or 40-year reigns. The qualifications just get less impressive as you move toward historical accuracy. The development of cities from villages to urban centers involves transformations that the mythology captures through narratives of divine planning and intervention. In reality, cities grow incrementally over centuries. A small temple becomes a temple complex, a few houses become a neighborhood, irrigation ditches become elaborate canal systems, craft workshops multiply and specialize. But the mythology compresses this process into moments of divine decision. The gods choose a location, decree a city's foundation, assign it a patron deity, grant it kingship for a specified period. Historical process becomes theological drama. The archaeological record of early Sumerian urbanism shows this gradual development clearly. Uruk, for instance, expands from a small settlement in the Ubaid period, 5000 BCE, to a major city of perhaps 50,000 people by 2900 BCE. The famous White Temple complex evolves through multiple building phases, each structure built atop the ruins of the previous one, creating the artificial elevation that will eventually become the ziggurat platform. Pottery types change, tool technologies improve, writing emerges and develops, all through slow accumulation of innovations rather than sudden revolutionary moments. The messiness of real history gets cleaned up into neat mythological narratives. But here's where things get interesting from a fringe perspective. Some alternative historians look at the sophisticated urban planning visible in ancient Sumerian cities, the regular street grids, the complex drainage systems, the massive public architecture, and conclude that this represents knowledge transfer from some external advanced source. Whether that source is Atlantis or aliens or time travelers varies by theorist, but the core claim remains the same. Humans in 3000 BCE weren't smart enough to figure this out themselves, so someone must have helped them. The evidence against this claim is overwhelming. We can literally watch Mesopotamian urbanism develop gradually over millennia, see the innovations accumulate, trace the learning process. But the alternative theories persist because they offer more dramatic narratives than people got incrementally better at building cities over many generations. The flood mythology, which serves as the great dividing line in Mesopotamian chronology, deserves careful attention. Multiple textual traditions preserve flood narratives, the most famous being the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the earlier Atrahasis epic. The basic plot: the gods become annoyed with humanity. Reasons vary. We're too noisy, too numerous, too sinful. Decide to destroy civilization through a great flood. But one wise god, usually Enki, warns a faithful human, Ziusudra, Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim depending on version, who builds a boat, loads it with animals and seeds and craftspeople, survives the deluge, and receives divine blessing to restart civilization. The fourth scholarly debate centers on whether the Mesopotamian flood narratives preserve memory of actual catastrophic flooding events. The Tigris and Euphrates river systems certainly produced destructive floods, and archaeological evidence shows flood layers at several Mesopotamian sites, though these layers occur at different times and don't represent a single universal deluge. Some scholars argue that particularly severe floods, perhaps combined with other disasters, could have generated cultural trauma that eventually crystallized into universal flood mythology. Others maintain that the flood narrative serves purely theological and literary functions without requiring any specific historical trigger. The biblical flood story, clearly influenced by Mesopotamian sources, further complicates attempts to separate historical kernel from mythological elaboration. Imagine yourself as Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, watching storm clouds gather according to divine warning. You've spent years building this enormous boat, according to specifications provided by Enki, enduring mockery from neighbors who think you've lost your mind. The first drops of rain fall, then heavier precipitation, then torrential deluge that continues day after day. The rivers overflow their banks, the canals burst their boundaries, the marshes flood beyond recognition. Everything familiar disappears under rising water. You're sealed inside your vessel with the concentrated essence of civilization, animals, seeds, knowledge, hope, while outside the world ends. The sensory deprivation of that experience, the darkness and confinement and uncertainty, becomes a collective cultural memory preserved in story. The flood wipes away the antediluvian world, drowning the cities, destroying the monuments, killing everything except what survives in the ark. It represents cosmic reset, divine judgment, the reassertion of chaos over order. But it's also temporary. The waters recede, land re-emerges, life begins again. The pattern of destruction and renewal becomes central to Mesopotamian religious thinking, reflected in seasonal festivals that ritually reenact cosmic crisis and resolution, in king lists that show dynasties rising and falling, in the very landscape that forms and reforms through annual flood cycles. Joke 3. Utnapishtim's neighbors before the flood definitely regretted not taking him seriously. Okay, we apologize for calling you crazy for building a giant boat in the desert. You were absolutely right. Can we please get on board now? Sorry, the ark is currently at capacity with breeding pairs of every species. Should have believed me earlier. Being right about apocalypse must provide some small satisfaction even while watching civilization drown. After the flood, kingship descends from heaven again, this time to the city of Kish, marking the beginning of post-diluvian history. The kings still reign for implausibly long periods at first, 1560 years for the first Kish dynasty collectively, but the numbers gradually approach normal human lifespans as the king list progresses forward in time. This mathematical movement from mythological to historical time mirrors the gradual shift in the nature of the sources themselves, from pure myth to legendary history to texts that can be cross-referenced with other documentary evidence. The early post-flood period sees the development of the political pattern that will dominate Mesopotamian history for centuries, competing city-states, each claiming divine favor, each trying to achieve hegemony over neighbors, each rising and falling in influence. Kish, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, these cities war with each other, form temporary alliances, experience periods of dominance, decline, and get conquered. The king list presents this as orderly succession, kingship passing from city to city by divine decree, but actual history was messier, with multiple cities simultaneously claiming kingship, with conflicting chronologies, with power struggles and ambitious rulers and contingent events. The fifth joke: if you think modern politics involves too much fighting between different factions, be grateful you don't live in early Mesopotamia, where even the gods can't decide which city should have political power, leading to divine assembly meetings that probably resembled contentious committee sessions. All in favor of giving kingship to Uruk for the next few centuries. Opposed? Abstentions? Divine democracy produces divine gridlock. One of the most important early post-flood rulers is Etana of Kish, famous for a myth where he rides on an eagle's back trying to reach heaven to obtain the plant of birth so his wife can produce an heir. The story combines fantastic imagery, flying to heaven on an eagle, with very human concerns, wanting children, ensuring succession. Etana eventually falls from the eagle and presumably dies, though the ending of the text is broken and uncertain. This combination of cosmic ambition and human limitation characterizes Mesopotamian royal mythology. Kings can attempt godlike feats but ultimately remain mortal, subject to the same biological constraints as ordinary humans. The development of Sumerian writing during this early dynastic period enables increasingly sophisticated record-keeping, legal codes, administrative documents, and literary texts. The earliest writing is purely economic, tracking grain rations, beer distributions, textile production, labor assignments, but gradually the technology expands to capture religious hymns, mythological narratives, royal inscriptions, diplomatic correspondence, scientific observations. Writing transforms from a counting tool to general-purpose technology for preserving thought across time and space. The scribes who master this technology become essential to royal administration, temple management, and cultural transmission. The sixth scholarly debate concerns the relationship between literacy and political power in early Mesopotamia. Some scholars argue that writing fundamentally transforms political organization by enabling bureaucratic administration on unprecedented scales, allowing centralized control of resources and people. Others suggest that literacy remains largely a tool of already existing power structures, temples and palaces, rather than a revolutionary force in its own right. The evidence probably supports both perspectives simultaneously. Writing enables new forms of power while also serving traditional authority structures. Imagine yourself in a scribal school in around 2500 BCE, one of maybe 100 students in the entire city learning to read and write. Your family has enough wealth to spare you from agricultural labor during your education, enough ambition to want you in royal or temple service rather than following your father's trade. You spend hours each day copying literary classics, portions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, hymns to various gods, proverbs and wisdom sayings, mathematical exercises. Your hands cramp, your eyes strain. The master criticizes your sign formation constantly. But you're learning to participate in the literate elite, to access knowledge preserved from deep past, to potentially rise in social status through intellectual achievement rather than birth or military prowess. The cities rising from primordial mud during this period developed distinctive civic identities. Uruk prides itself on monumental architecture and literary culture. Ur emphasizes maritime trade and commercial success. Lagash develops reputation for just administration and comprehensive law codes. Nippur, though never particularly large or politically powerful, maintains religious prestige as the sacred city of Enlil, where the divine assembly supposedly meets. These civic identities, expressed through patron deities and foundational myths and architectural styles, create cultural diversity within the broader unity of Sumerian civilization. The construction techniques used in this period involve impressive engineering achievements. The Sumerians lack significant stone resources, so everything gets built from mud bricks, sun-dried for ordinary construction, kiln-fired for important buildings. A major temple complex might require millions of bricks, each hand-formed in a mold, dried, transported, and placed according to architectural plans. The coordination of labor, management of resources, and mathematical precision necessary for these projects demonstrate sophisticated organizational capacity, regardless of whether you attribute that sophistication to Apkallu wisdom or human ingenuity developed through trial and error. Joke 6. Ancient Sumerian architecture is basically the ultimate work with what you've got situation. What building materials do we have? Mud. What else? Also mud. Great. Let's build a civilization that lasts 5,000 years. The ingenuity involved in making mud into monumental architecture deserves more appreciation than it typically receives. The religious practices that develop around kingship and cities involve daily care of divine statues as if they're living beings. The gods inhabit their statues, which must be fed, clothed, entertained, and protected. Priests perform elaborate morning and evening rituals, washing the statue, presenting food offerings, which temple staff later eat, burning incense, reciting prayers and hymns. The god's birthday receives special celebration. Major festivals involve parading the statue through city streets, allowing ordinary citizens to see and honor the deity. These practices make divine presence tangible and immediate, transforming abstract theology into sensory experience. The seventh debate among scholars concerns whether these practices should be understood as literally believed. Do Mesopotamians think the statue is the god, or as sophisticated symbolic drama that uses physical objects to represent transcendent realities? The textual evidence is ambiguous and probably was experienced differently by different people. Some inscriptions suggest literal identification of statue and deity. Others treat statues as dwelling places or representations rather than exact identities. The psychological and emotional reality of worship might not depend on resolving this theological question definitively. As we approach the end of this section, having watched cities rise and kings receive authority and civilization complexify, we might reflect on what gets preserved and what gets lost in the archaeological record. The mud brick buildings deteriorate back into mounded earth without constant maintenance. Organic materials, wood, textiles, leather, papyrus, decay almost completely in Mesopotamian soil conditions. What survives is mostly durable materials: pottery, stone tools, metal objects, and most importantly, baked clay tablets. Our understanding of Sumerian civilization skews toward what they wrote down, which is necessarily incomplete. The songs people sang while working, the jokes they told, the private conversations, the daily textures of lived experience, mostly lost, leaving only the official and monumental. The eighth and final joke: future archaeologists studying our civilization will similarly develop skewed understanding based on what survives. The 21st century humans apparently devoted enormous energy to creating memes, which they inscribed on digital tablets and shared through mysterious ritual networks. The religious significance remains unclear, but they clearly found great meaning in images of cats expressing sardonic attitudes toward various aspects of existence. We're all preserving fragments that will puzzle future scholars. The section on cities rising from primordial mud thus closes with civilization established, cities built, kingship institutionalized, knowledge preserved in writing, humans organized into complex societies pursuing survival and meaning and occasionally beauty through cooperative effort and divine sanction. The formless age lies far behind, the historical age approaches, the great mythological narratives transition into something that starts resembling recorded history, even if the boundary between them remains necessarily fuzzy. And so we arrive at the edge of sleep and the edge of historical time, standing at the boundary where mythology becomes chronicle and cosmic drama becomes human record. We've journeyed from absolute formlessness through divine creation, through cultural foundation, through the establishment of civilization, following the oldest written traditions humanity possesses as they trace the movement from nothing to something, from unity to plurality, from chaos to order. The Mesopotamian vision we've explored tonight offers no easy comfort, no promise of inevitable progress, no guarantee of divine benevolence. Instead, it presents existence as ongoing achievement, order as fragile accomplishment, meaning as something humans and gods collaborate to create and maintain against the constant threat of dissolution. The Namu waters, the primordial ocean, haven't disappeared in these narratives. They remain beneath and around everything, the permanent possibility of return to formlessness. Every flood proves this, every canal that silts up, every city that gets abandoned and swallowed by earth, every writing system that gets forgotten, every knowledge that gets lost. The Sumerians understand impermanence not as philosophical abstraction, but as environmental reality, and their mythology reflects this understanding. Creation isn't a one-time event safely in the past, it's a continuous process requiring constant effort. The gods work, humans work, and through that collaborative labor, the ordered world persists for a while before eventually succumbing to entropy and requiring renewal. This worldview might seem depressing from certain contemporary perspectives that expect narratives of redemption, of eternal souls achieving blessed immortality, of cosmic justice guaranteeing eventual vindication for suffering. The Mesopotamian vision offers none of these consolations. You're created to work. You'll labor your whole life maintaining systems you didn't choose and can't fundamentally change. You'll die without achieving immortality or escaping mortal limitation. The gods might help if properly worshipped, but could easily destroy you if annoyed. Existence is difficult, death is certain, the universe operates according to divine whims you can't fully understand or control. Sweet dreams. Yet, there's something bracing and oddly honest in this mythology's refusal to promise what it can't deliver. The Sumerians don't lie to themselves about reality's fundamental harshness. They acknowledge that civilization requires continuous maintenance, that knowledge must be actively transmitted, or it disappears, that order emerges from chaos only through sustained effort, and can slip back into chaos if that effort ceases. These aren't mystical claims, but observable facts about how complex systems behave. Thermodynamics favors disorder. Information decays without preservation. Structures require upkeep. The Sumerians build their religion on these principles rather than denying them. The legacy of these earliest written traditions extends far beyond ancient Mesopotamia. The flood narrative influences biblical stories, which in turn shape Western cultural consciousness for millennia. The creation through divine speech, the separation of waters, the formation of dry land, these motifs appear in Genesis with obvious Mesopotamian antecedents. The concept of kingship as divinely sanctioned persists through countless monarchies and empires. The idea that civilization represents triumph over chaos, that culture must be deliberately maintained against barbarism, that knowledge requires institutional preservation, these assumptions continue informing modern thinking even when we don't recognize their ancient sources. The archaeological rediscovery of Mesopotamian civilization in the 19th and 20th centuries caused considerable excitement and some theological anxiety as scholars recognized that biblical narratives had Mesopotamian precursors predating them by millennia. The flood story wasn't unique to Israel. The creation accounts had ancient parallels. Even the law codes that seemed distinctively biblical had Mesopotamian precedents like the Code of Hammurabi. This recognition shifted understanding of biblical literature from sui generis divine revelation to participant in wider ancient Near Eastern cultural conversations. Some readers found this diminishing, others found it enriching, situating biblical texts within their historical and cultural context rather than isolating them as entirely unique productions. The Sumerian language itself died as a spoken tongue sometime around 2000 BCE, replaced by Akkadian as the lingua franca of Mesopotamia, but it persisted as a scholarly and liturgical language for another 1500 years, studied in scribal schools the way Latin was studied in medieval Europe. The latest cuneiform tablets we possess date to the 1st century CE, meaning the writing system invented around 3200 BCE persisted for over 3 millennia, a remarkable run by any standard. Then it disappeared completely from living knowledge, the tablets unreadable, the language unknown, the entire civilization forgotten except for biblical references to Babylon and Assyria. The decipherment of cuneiform in the mid-19th century, primarily by British and French scholars working from multilingual inscriptions, reopened access to Mesopotamian thought after 17 centuries of silence. Suddenly, these voices from deep antiquity became audible again, telling us how they understood creation, kingship, justice, divinity, humanity. The recovery represents one of the great intellectual achievements of modern scholarship, reconstructing dead languages from minimal clues, piecing together fragmentary tablets, rebuilding ancient libraries from scattered ruins, giving voice to the voiceless past. As you lie there drifting towards sleep, your consciousness gradually releasing its grip on waking categories and distinctions, you're perhaps experiencing a minor echo of the return to primordial waters that the Mesopotamian texts describe. The boundaries that define you during waking life, self and world, subject and object, past and present, soften and blur. Your thoughts become less linear, more associative, flowing into each other like waters mixing. You're not exactly disappearing, but you're losing your sharp edges, your insistence on separation. This nightly dissolution and morning reconstitution, this daily cycle of form and formlessness, might be the closest we come to experiencing the cosmic patterns that mythology describes on larger scales. The modern world, with its electric lights that banish darkness and its constant connectivity that eliminates silence and its technologies that promise to overcome all natural limitations, sometimes forgets what ancient peoples knew intimately. That order is expensive, that complexity is fragile, that everything built will eventually crumble. Our contemporary fantasies of endless progress, of technology solving all problems, of human mastery over nature, these would seem strange to Sumerian ears. They knew that the rivers flood unpredictably, that harvests fail, despite proper ritual, that empires rise and fall regardless of their rulers' ambitions or virtues. They built anyway, wrote anyway, created beauty and knowledge and social complexity anyway, not because they believed it would last forever, but because creating order from chaos is apparently what humans do, even knowing that chaos eventually returns. The specific gods the Sumerians worshipped, An and Enlil and Enki and Inanna and the rest, no longer receive prayers or offerings. Their temples lie in ruins, their rituals ceased, their festivals unobserved. In that sense, the Mesopotamian religious world has ended completely. But the questions they grappled with persist. Where does existence come from? How should societies organize themselves? What gives life meaning? How do we maintain order against entropy? What do we owe the past and the future? These aren't questions that get permanently answered and filed away. Each generation must address them anew, using whatever conceptual and symbolic resources their culture provides. The formless age, that primordial state before differentiation, represents something that each of us might recognize in certain experiences. The moment before waking, when you're conscious but unformed, aware but without specific content to awareness. The creative blankness before artistic work begins, when anything is possible because nothing is actual yet. The oceanic feeling that mystics describe, the dissolution of ego boundaries into something larger and more fundamental. The deep rest that comes when consciousness releases its constant activity and simply exists without grasping or striving. These experiences don't require believing in literal primordial waters or divine beings or any specific metaphysical claims. They're available to anyone willing to quiet the constant mental chatter, to release identification with the constructed self, to rest in awareness without imposing structure on it. The Mesopotamian mythology provides one language for describing and valuing these states, but the states themselves transcend any particular cultural formulation. They're human universals, recognized across different times and places, and expressed through various symbolic systems. As this script approaches its end, and you hopefully approach sleep, let me offer final appreciation for the Sumerian scribes who preserved these traditions, the archaeologists who recovered them, the scholars who deciphered and translated them, and the human imagination that created them in the first place. These weren't naive primitives telling simplistic stories. They were sophisticated thinkers using the best conceptual tools available to them, grappling with profound questions, creating narratives that function simultaneously as religion, philosophy, political theory, social commentary, and literary art. We do them disservice when we read their myths as merely quaint pre-scientific beliefs. We honor them when we recognize the genuine intellectual achievement their traditions represent. The invitation remains open. If you enjoyed this journey through Mesopotamian cosmology, if the gentle voice and strange ancient stories helped you relax towards sleep, consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more nights ahead, many more historical mysteries to explore, many more forgotten voices to recover from the deep past. But only subscribe if you genuinely value this approach to history and mythology. I'm interested in building a community of fellow insomniacs and ancient world enthusiasts, not accumulating empty subscriber counts. The darkness outside your window, wherever you're listening from, connects you to countless generations who also watched nightfall and wondered about origins and endings, who also felt small beneath vast skies, who also created stories to make sense of their brief existence in an ancient universe. The Sumerians stared at the same stars, felt the same mixture of wonder and terror at existence, died the same death that awaits us all. Their particular answers to life's questions differ from ours, but the questions themselves persist. Close your eyes now if you haven't already. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Release the thoughts that chase each other through your mind, the concerns that tomorrow will bring soon enough. For now, float in the formless space between waking and sleeping. that daily return to the primordial waters. The Namu Ocean receives you as it has received humans every night since consciousness first emerged to wonder about its own existence. Rest in that ancient darkness. Let the boundaries dissolve. Sleep, if you can, knowing that morning will bring renewed form, but for now, formlessness is enough. The clay tablets grow silent, the cuneiform signs blur, the ancient cities sink back into earth, the rivers flow on, carrying silt toward the sea, depositing new land, preparing for future civilizations that will rise and flourish and eventually join their predecessors in archaeological strata. Nothing lasts, everything changes. The formless waters wait patiently beneath all constructed order, and in this recognition of impermanence, perhaps we find strange peace, released from the burden of permanence, free to create knowing that creation is temporary, able to rest in the continuous flow of existence that predates us and will continue after we're gone. End of script. Sweet